The thunderous sound of shelves crashing down echoed through Taylor's family supermarket, followed by a blood-curdling scream that froze everyone in their tracks. "You're fired. Get out of my sight now." Brandon Miller's booming voice, the new general manager, reverberated through the aisles, causing customers and employees to stop in their tracks, stunned as they watched the scene unfold. Amanda Thompson, a dedicated cashier who had faithfully served the supermarket for 15 years, trembled as tears streamed down her face. Her only crime had been defending an elderly lady whom Brandon had treated rudely minutes before. What he didn't know, or perhaps didn't care to know, was that this simple, humble-looking lady was Emily Taylor, the founder and former owner of the establishment. The tension in the air was palpable. Customers watched in horror as Brandon, in his immaculate Italian suit and polished shoes, pointed an accusing finger at Amanda. His face was red with anger, and a vein pulsed in his forehead as he continued his authoritarian speech. "Let this be an example to all of you," he bellowed, spinning on his heels to face the other employees who had gathered around. "This establishment has new rules now. Anyone who can't adapt can look for another job." Emily Taylor, at 68 years old and with a dignity that no humiliation could shake, watched the scene with a broken heart. The supermarket she had built over 3 decades, transforming it from a small grocery store into one of the most respected establishments in the neighborhood, was unrecognizable under Brandon's tyrannical management. "Please, Mr. Miller," Emily finally spoke up, her voice calm but firm, cutting through the tense silence that had settled. "There's no need to. And as for you," Brandon abruptly interrupted her, turning to face her, "I've already told you that I don't want unauthorized people handling the merchandise. The fact that you were once the owner doesn't give you the right to interfere with my management." The silence that followed was deafening. David Anderson, the produce manager who had worked there since opening day, clenched his fists so tight his knuckles turned white. Other employees lowered their gaze, embarrassed by the situation but too afraid to intervene. Emily remained serene, although her blue eyes revealed a deep sadness. This wasn't the legacy she had envisioned when she handed over the management to her son John. The establishment had always been more than just a business. It was a place where employees and customers felt part of a big family. News of Emily's public humiliation and Amanda's unjust dismissal spread quickly through the neighborhood. Taylor's family supermarket, once known for its welcoming atmosphere and exceptional service, was now the subject of whispered conversations about tyranny and disrespect. Brandon Miller had arrived just 3 months ago, hired by John Taylor when he had to step away due to heart problems. At 35 and with an MBA in business administration, Brandon had an efficiency reputation that initially impressed. However, his aggressive approach and arrogance soon began to reveal his true character. In the weeks leading up to the incident, he had already implemented drastic changes without consulting anyone. He altered work schedules that had been established for years, reorganized entire departments, and imposed virtually unattainable sales targets. Long-time, dedicated employees were treated as mere numbers on a spreadsheet, and the family environment that Emily had cultivated for so long was being systematically destroyed. That night, after closing time, a group of employees gathered secretly in the stockroom. The air was heavy with concern and indignation. Amanda, still shaken, sat on an empty box while her colleagues tried to console her. "We can't let this continue," David declared, his voice trembling with contained anger. "Miss Emily built this place with love and dedication. She treated each of us like family. And now to see her being humiliated like this. But what can we do?" asked Lisa, a young stalker. "Brandon has total authority while Mr. John is away. And we all need these jobs." The group discussed various possibilities, but fear was evident in their voices. Brandon had created an environment of terror, where any questioning was met with immediate retaliation. The situation seemed hopeless. Meanwhile, in her modest house on the outskirts of town, Emily sat in her favorite armchair, mentally reviewing the day's events. The walls around her were decorated with photographs that told the supermarket's story: the opening 30 years ago, the expansions, the staff gatherings, the smiles and hugs that made that establishment much more than just a business. In one of the photos, she and John were cutting a ribbon at the opening of the supermarket's new wing. Her son had always been a gentle and competent administrator, following in her footsteps and treating employees humanely. His need to step away due to health issues had been a hard blow, but no one could have predicted that his temporary replacement would turn into a nightmare. Emily picked up the phone several times, considering calling John to tell him about the situation. But her son was already dealing with enough problems, focusing on his recovery. She didn't want to add more worries to his already delicate health condition. The next morning, Brandon arrived at the supermarket earlier than usual. His immaculate black suit and rigid posture contrasted with the still sleepy atmosphere of the establishment. He walked through the aisles inspecting every detail, making notes on his clipboard, and occasionally casting critical glances at employees starting their shifts. What Brandon failed to realize was that his display of authority the day before had planted the seeds of his own downfall. His arrogance blinded him to the fact that respect isn't earned through fear, and that true lessons in humility often come in the most unexpected ways. The sun had barely risen, but the day's events were already in motion, setting the stage for a transformation that no one, especially Brandon Miller, could anticipate. The lesson in humility that approached would be just the beginning of a journey that would change not only his career but his very essence as a human being. News of Emily Taylor's humiliation and Amanda's unjust dismissal spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. In the days that followed, a subtle but significant change began to take shape at Taylor's family supermarket. Longtime customers who had frequented the establishment for decades began to dwindle. The lively buzz that once filled the aisles was replaced by a heavy, uncomfortable silence. However, Brandon Miller seemed oblivious to the transformation. In his obsessive pursuit of efficiency and modernization, he began implementing even stricter measures. Security cameras were installed in every corner of the establishment, and a point system was created to evaluate employee performance. Those who didn't meet the established targets faced public warnings and constant threats of dismissal. "We need to increase productivity by 30% this month," Brandon declared during a morning meeting, his tone leaving no room for questions. "Anyone who can't keep up with the pace can look for another job. The market is full of people wanting an opportunity." The employees exchanged nervous glances. Jenny, a young cashier who had replaced Amanda, tried to hold back tears as Brandon detailed the new impossible targets. Beside her, David Anderson, the experienced produce manager, clenched his fists under the table, his anger contained only by the fear of losing the job he'd held for so many years. Meanwhile, at her home, Emily spent her mornings organizing old photographs and documents from the supermarket. Among them, she found the first lease contract for the small space that, 3 decades ago, housed just a modest grocery store. Her trembling hands caressed the yellowed paper, and memories flooded her mind. "Mrs. Taylor?" A familiar voice pulled her from her thoughts. It was Margaret Wilson, a longtime customer who had become a close friend over the years. "Sorry to show up unannounced, but I needed to see how you were doing." Emily offered a tired smile and invited Margaret in. The two women settled in the small living room, where the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. Margaret didn't take long to address the issue that had brought her there. "The supermarket is unrecognizable, Emily," she began, her voice heavy with concern. "That new manager, he's destroying everything you built. This morning I saw him yelling at little Tommy, you know? That boy who makes deliveries after school." The poor thing was in tears. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of those words. Tommy was only 16 and worked part-time to help his widowed mother. He was one of the many employees she considered part of her extended family. "The worst part is that customers are starting to avoid the store," Margaret continued. "Mrs. Richards, who's been shopping there since opening day, told me she now prefers to go across town to do her shopping. She can't stand to see how things have changed." At the supermarket, Brandon continued his crusade for efficiency. That afternoon he gathered all employees to announce more changes. The new productivity monitoring system would be implemented immediately, and lunch breaks would be reduced to maximize work time. "Starting today, every minute will be timed," he declared, adjusting his expensive tie with a satisfied smile. "I want detailed reports of all activities. We need to eliminate any idle time." Lisa, the young stalker, timidly raised her hand. "Mr. Miller, what about the times when we need to help elderly or special needs customers? That's always been part of our—" "I don't care how things were done before," Brandon cut her off, his tone ice cold. "If a customer needs special assistance, they should bring a companion. We're not a charity institution." That night, after closing, David stayed in the stockroom longer than usual. While organizing product boxes, his thoughts drifted back to the day Emily hired him 25 years ago. He was just a nervous young man with no experience, but she saw something in him that other employers hadn't noticed. Carefully, David pulled his cell phone from his pocket and dialed a familiar number. After a few rings, a sleepy voice answered. "Hello? Robert? Sorry to call so late, but I need your help," said David, his voice low but determined. "It's about John Taylor. Do you still have contact with the nurse who takes care of him?" Robert, a longtime supplier of the supermarket and close friend of the Taylor family, confirmed that he did. David continued, "We need to find a way to let him know what's happening here. Things are completely spinning out of control." While this conversation was taking place in the stockroom, Brandon was in his office, admiring the productivity graphs on his computer. For him, numbers were all that mattered. The fact that sales volume had started to decline didn't worry him. He had ready-made explanations to justify any questioning. What Brandon didn't know was that his actions had triggered a chain reaction that was about to reach him. While he was boasting about his authority, a network of people committed to the true spirit of Taylor's family supermarket was beginning to mobilize. At her home, Emily held an old photograph where she, John, and all the employees were smiling during a Christmas party. Her son always said that the supermarket's success wasn't in the numbers, but in the hearts of the people who were part of that family. Maybe it was time to remind him of that. With renewed determination, Emily picked up the phone. It was time to take action, not just for herself, but for all those who had dedicated their lives to building something special in that place. The transformation that was about to happen would be more profound than Brandon Miller could imagine. The private hospital where John Taylor was recovering was immersed in the typical silence of the early morning hours. The antiseptic corridors, illuminated by the soft dawn light, witnessed only the discreet movement of the medical team starting another day. In his room, John absently flipped through a magazine while watching the city wake up through the panoramic window. 3 months of recovery had tested his patience, but the doctors insisted on the need for caution after cardiac surgery. Kate Williams, his nurse for 12 weeks, entered with breakfast. There was something different in her expression that morning, an evident uneasiness in her hesitant movements and concerned look. John knew her well enough to notice that something was troubling her. "Mr. Taylor," she began, nervously adjusting her uniform while placing the tray on the mobile table. "I know I shouldn't get involved, but..." Kate paused, biting her lower lip. "Last night, I received a very concerning call about the supermarket." John straightened up in bed, immediately alert. The heart monitor beside him registered a slight acceleration in his heartbeat. "What happened, Kate? Please tell me." "The new manager, Brandon Miller?" Kate hesitated again, her hands nervously intertwining. "He's causing serious problems. He unjustly fired Amanda Thompson, that employee who worked there for 15 years. He publicly humiliated your mother in front of all the customers. The employees are terrified, living under constant threat of dismissal." As Kate detailed the events of the past few weeks, color gradually drained from John's face. His heart, still recovering, beat faster and faster, causing the monitor to emit a discreet warning sound. The idea of his mother being humiliated and his loyal employees being mistreated was simply unbearable. "Why didn't anyone tell me before?" he asked, his voice trembling with anger and frustration. His hands gripped the sheet so tightly that his knuckles were white. "Your mother didn't want to worry you during your recovery," explained Kate, adjusting the heart monitor with experienced fingers. "She was trying to protect you, but things have reached a critical point. David Anderson, the produce manager, contacted me through Robert, begging me to tell you the truth." John closed his eyes, breathing deeply as he had learned in physiotherapy sessions. Memories of his childhood in the supermarket flooded his mind, his mother always treating each employee like family, celebrating birthdays, sharing joys and sorrows. The business his parents had built with so much love was being torn apart by an arrogant tyrant. At that same moment, in the supermarket, Brandon was conducting another one of his intimidating morning meetings. The meeting room, once a place for friendly gatherings and joint planning, had transformed into a chamber of psychological torture under his management. This time, his target was the bakery department. "Sales dropped 15% last month," he bellowed, slamming a folder on the table hard enough to make the coffee cups rattle. "It's simply unacceptable. From today on, any unsold product will be deducted from the department employees' salaries." Mary Johnson, the veteran head baker who had worked there for 2 decades, felt her stomach turn. With courage born from years of dedication to the establishment, she tried to argue, "But Mr. Miller, we've always donated unsold products to the local senior home. It was an arrangement Mrs. Emily established years ago. Many elderly people depend on this donation for..." "This outdated and sentimental practice ends today," Brandon interrupted, pounding the table. His eyes flashed with anger as he stared down each employee present. "I don't care what that old woman used to do. We're here to make profit, not to do charity. This isn't a community center, it's a business." What Brandon didn't notice was the glint of determination in Mary's eyes, nor the way other employees exchanged meaningful glances. After the meeting, She discreetly made her way to the stockroom, where David was waiting among carefully organized stacks of boxes. "He's crossed all lines," whispered Mary, her hands trembling with indignation. "Calling Mrs. Emily that old woman, forbidding donations to the senior home. This can't continue, David. We need to do something." David nodded gravely, showing his phone. "John knows everything now. Kate just confirmed she told him this morning. Now it's only a matter of time before things change." The news spread quickly among the longtime employees like a whisper of hope. Years of loyalty to the Taylor family had created bonds stronger than any of Brandon's threats could break. Meanwhile, completely oblivious to the brewing storm, Brandon continued his routine of terror. In his meticulously organized office, he analyzed spreadsheets and graphs with a satisfied smile. The walls, once decorated with photos of the supermarket's history, now displayed only performance charts and targets. With these cost cuts, he muttered to himself, profits will soar. I'd like to see someone question my competence after this. The phone on his desk rang, interrupting his delusions of grandeur. It was from reception. "Mr. Miller, Mrs. Emily Taylor is here to see you." Brandon sighed irritably, running his hand through his perfectly groomed hair. "I already said I don't want to be bothered by." "She's not alone," the receptionist continued, her voice trembling slightly. "Mr. John Taylor is with her." The blood froze in Brandon's veins. John Taylor? But shouldn't he be in the hospital? His mind quickly calculated all possibilities, all explanations he could give. Before he could respond, the door to his office opened, revealing Emily and John. John Taylor was visibly thinner due to hospitalization, and a slight tremor in his hands betrayed his still fragile state. But his eyes carried an iron determination that made Brandon swallow hard. "Mr. Miller," John's voice was low but sharp as a blade. "I think we need to have a conversation about your management." Brandon stood up, trying to maintain the professional composure he valued so much, but his face betrayed his nervousness. Beads of sweat began forming on his well-groomed forehead. "Mr. Taylor, what a surprise. I wasn't expecting." "Obviously not," John interrupted, his voice laden with controlled anger. "Just as you didn't expect me to find out about your actions here. About how you treated my mother, how you fired dedicated employees, how you destroyed everything we built over decades." Emily remained silent, watching the scene with a mixture of sadness and determination. Her gaze met Brandon's, who for the first time since his arrival seemed to grasp the true weight of his actions. Her presence, though silent, carried the weight of 30 years of history and dedication. "Mr. Taylor, I can explain," Brandon began, his usual arrogance giving way to an almost pleading tone. "All the changes I implemented were made with the establishment's efficiency and profit in mind." "The numbers? Profit?" John laughed humorlessly, a bitter sound that echoed through the room. "You call driving away our most loyal customers profit? Destroying the family spirit that was always our trademark? Humiliating people who dedicated their lives to this place?" Brandon began sweating profusely. His hands trembled as he tried to organize papers on his desk, as if those numbers could save him. "The results show?" "The results show that you failed miserably," John cut in, placing a different report on the desk. "While you were busy terrorizing employees and customers, our sales dropped 40%. 40%, Miller?" The silence that followed was deafening. Brandon stared fixedly at the report, his mind trying to process the reality unfolding before him. His entire world of efficiency and numbers was crumbling like a house of cards. "But I have a work agreement," Brandon tried to argue, his voice now almost a whisper. "A contract?" "A contract that you yourself violated repeatedly," replied John, his voice now firmer. "Moral harassment, unilateral changes to working conditions, discrimination. Shall I continue? I have a whole folder of complaints and evidence here." Emily finally spoke, her voice surprisingly gentle. "Brandon, this supermarket was never just a business. It's home to hundreds of people who depend on it not only for their livelihood but for their dignity. Something you clearly didn't understand?" Brandon sank into his chair, feeling the weight of each word. The empire of terror he had built was about to crumble, and no spreadsheet or report could save him now. His reflection in the window glass showed a very different man from the arrogant manager who had arrived 3 months ago, a man about to learn a hard lesson about humility. John Taylor leaned on the edge of Brandon's desk, his pale face betraying the physical effort this confrontation was demanding from his still recovering body. Emily, noticing her son's fatigue, quickly pulled up a chair. "You have 2 options, Miller," said John, carefully sitting down. The first is to leave right now with a basic letter of recommendation and your final salary. The second? He made a meaningful pause, his eyes fixed on Brandon. The second is to face a lawsuit for moral harassment and fraudulent management. Brandon swallowed hard, his once arrogant face now marked by fear. Lawsuit? But I didn't do anything illegal. All my decisions were based on modern management practices. Modern practices? John interrupted, his voice laden with disbelief. Deducting unsold products from employees' salaries? Timing bathroom breaks? Setting impossible goals to justify dismissals? That's not modern management, Miller. It's deliberate cruelty. Emily, who had maintained a dignified silence until then, walked to the wall where photographs of the supermarket's history once hung. In their place, only cold graphs and charts stared back. You know, Brandon, she began, gently touching the empty wall, when my husband and I started this business, we had nothing but a small rented space and a lot of love for what we did. Our first employee was Amanda Thompson's mother, the same Amanda Thompson you so cruelly fired. Brandon shifted uncomfortably in his chair as Emily continued. Margaret Thompson was pregnant and no one would hire her. We didn't just give her a job, we became Amanda's godparents. Every person who works here has a similar story. They're more than employees, they're family. The sound of lively voices from the hallway momentarily interrupted the conversation. It was lunchtime and employees were starting to gather in the small break area. Brandon had reduced the break to just 30 minutes, arguing it was more than enough time. You've turned a healthy workplace into a concentration camp, John continued, his voice now firmer. But the worst part wasn't your inhumane policies, it was your complete disregard for this house's legacy. At that moment, David gently knocked on the door before entering. In his hands he carried a thick folder full of documents. Mr. John, I brought what you asked for. Brandon watched with growing apprehension as David placed the folder on the desk. The veteran employee then turned to Emily, a warm smile lighting up his tired face. Mrs. Emily, you can't imagine how good it is to see you here again. John opened the folder, revealing dozens of testimonies, photos, and records. Every employee you humiliated, every customer you mistreated, every labor law you violated, it's all documented here. Our lawyer says there's enough material for multiple lawsuits. Brandon stood up abruptly, his chair creaking against the floor. This is absurd. You can't threaten me like this. I'm a qualified professional with an MBA. Your MBA clearly didn't teach you the basics of people management, Emily interrupted, her voice surprisingly firm. You may understand numbers, Brandon, but you completely failed to understand the heart of this business. David cleared his throat discreetly. Excuse me, but there's something else you need to see. He pulled out a specific set of documents from the folder. We discovered some irregularities in Mr. Miller's accounting statements. Brandon's face visibly paled. What irregularities? Everything I did was completely within accounting standards. The bonuses you granted yourself? David continued, relentless. The unfair deductions from employee salaries? The misappropriation of funds from the benefits pool to your administrative expenses account? John took the documents, examining them carefully. His face hardened as he read each page. This is more serious than we thought, Miller. This isn't just poor management, it's fraud. Brandon collapsed back into his chair, all his previous arrogance completely dissipated. I can explain. It was all to maximize company profits? To maximize your own gains, you mean? John corrected. While you were cutting employee benefits and squeezing every last penny from the budget, you increased your own salary 3 times in 3 months? Emily sighed deeply, years of experience reflected in her gaze. Brandon, when we hired you, we expected a professional who could modernize our management without destroying our essence. Instead, you chose the path of tyranny and dishonesty. The murmur outside was growing louder. You could hear the employees' voices, some carrying restrained laughter, something that hadn't happened since Brandon took over management. The contrast between the atmosphere outside and the tension inside the room was palpable. So, Miller, John leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Brandon's. What will your choice be? Leave now, quietly, or face the legal consequences of your actions? Brandon looked around the room like a cornered animal searching for an escape route. His empire of terror, built on threats and manipulation, was crumbling before his eyes. Every chart on the wall, every spreadsheet on his desk, everything seemed to mock his current situation. I need time to think, he stammered, nervously tugging at the knot of his expensive tie. You have exactly 5 minutes, John replied, checking his watch. After that, our lawyer will initiate legal proceedings. The silence that followed was deafening. Brandon stared fixedly at his now trembling hands, while Emily's words about family and legacy echoed in his mind. For the first time since taking the position, he was beginning to understand the true cost of his arrogance. David remained standing near the door, a silent but significant presence. His years of dedication to the supermarket were a living testimony to the kind of loyalty Brandon had never managed to understand, a loyalty built not through fear, but through mutual respect and care. Outside, the supermarket's life continued its course. The aroma of fresh bread from the bakery, customer conversations, the familiar sound of shopping carts, all the symphony of an establishment that was much more than just a business. It was a place where stories intertwined, where lives were built, where each person was part of something greater. The 5 minutes granted to Brandon dragged on like an eternity. The silence in the room was broken only by the ticking of the wall clock and his own heavy breathing. His hands, once steady while signing termination notices and warnings, now trembled uncontrollably on the mahogany desk he was so proud of. "Time's up," John announced, his voice cutting through the air like a razor. "What's your decision, Miller?" Brandon raised his eyes, meeting three pairs that stared at him with different expressions: Emily's veiled compassion, John's unwavering firmness, and David's contained satisfaction. His world of absolute authority had transformed into a nightmare in a matter of minutes. He began, his voice failing. He cleared his throat and tried again, nervously adjusting his Italian silk tie. "I accept the first option. I'll leave." John nodded gravely, but before he could speak, Emily stepped forward. Her gentle face carried an expression that surprised everyone, including her son. "I have a different proposal," she said, her voice calm but firm. "A third option that might interest Mr. Miller." Brandon frowned, confused. John shot his mother a questioning look, but she continued, her eyes fixed on the former manager. "Instead of simply leaving, I suggest you stay with us for a while longer." She made a meaningful pause, but in a different position. "Mother," John began, concerned, but Emily raised her hand, asking for silence. "Brandon Miller, you will spend the next 3 months working as the supermarket's janitor," she declared, causing astonishment in everyone present. "You'll receive the salary compatible with the position and follow all the rules that you yourself implemented." Brandon's face completely lost its color. "Janitor? But that's ridiculous. I have an MBA, management experience, and clearly no understanding of the real value of work," Emily completed. "Consider this a learning opportunity, not a punishment. You'll get to know the supermarket from a completely different perspective." David, who was watching the scene with growing interest, couldn't suppress a small smile. "Mr. William, our current janitor, is about to retire. He can teach Mr. Miller everything about the position." Brandon looked desperately at John, seeking some support against this absurd proposal. But Emily's son merely crossed his arms, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Considering the alternatives," John said slowly, "I think my mother is being more than generous. You can accept this offer or face the lawsuits. The choice is yours." The silence that followed was heavy. Brandon felt sweat running down his back, staining his perfectly pressed dress shirt. The humiliation of trading his Italian suit for a janitor's uniform seemed unbearable. "Why?" he finally managed to ask, his voice almost a whisper. "Why give me this chance after everything I've done?" Emily stepped closer, her eyes gentle but determined. "Because I believe every person deserves a chance to learn and grow. You don't have to accept, but if you do, you might discover something valuable about yourself and the true meaning of management." At that moment, as if the universe wanted to emphasize Emily's words, the office door opened. It was William, the janitor, pushing his cleaning cart. Upon noticing the ongoing meeting, he began to apologize, but Emily called him in. William, a 65-year-old gentleman with a face marked by time but illuminated by a constant smile, pushed his cart into the room. Brandon watched, with a mixture of horror and fascination, the man who could become his mentor. "William," Emily began affectionately, "Mr. Miller here is interested in learning your position. Would you be willing to train him before your retirement?" William's tired but kind eyes fixed on Brandon, studying him for a moment. "Of course, Mrs. Emily. It will be my pleasure to teach the young man everything I know." The simplicity and dignity in William's response hit Brandon like a punch to the stomach. This man, whom he barely noticed during his daily inspections, showed more nobility in a single phrase than he had in all his memos and reports. "So, Miller?" John pressed. "What's your final decision?" Brandon looked at his hands, now devoid of the expensive rings he used to wear to impress. He thought about his career, the framed diplomas on his wall, the status he valued so much. Then he remembered Amanda's tears on the day of her dismissal, the frightened looks of the employees, Emily's silent dignity in the face of his humiliations. "I accept," he finally said, his voice low but clear. "I accept working as a janitor." A subtle smile appeared on Emily's lips. "Excellent. William, please take Mr. Miller to the locker room. He'll start immediately." As Brandon followed William out of the room, still stunned by the turn in his life, David approached John and Emily. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, concerned. "After everything he did?" Emily gently touched David's arm. "Sometimes, the greatest lesson in humility comes not from punishment, but from the opportunity to see the world through others' eyes." John watched through the window as Brandon, now following William's cleaning cart, crossed the parking lot. "You've always believed in the best in people, Mother. I hope you're right this time too." What none of them could imagine was that this decision would mark the beginning of a transformation much deeper than they expected. Brandon Miller, the arrogant manager who measured people's worth in spreadsheets, was about to learn lessons that no MBA could teach. That same afternoon, the supermarket employees watched, stunned, as their former manager crossed the aisles wearing the gray uniform of the cleaning staff. Some couldn't contain satisfied smiles, others showed genuine curiosity about how this unusual situation would develop. William, with the patience of someone who had lived long enough to understand life's mysteries, began instructing Brandon about the work tools, cleaning products, and daily routines. His calm, experienced voice contrasted with the former executive's evident nervousness. "The first thing you need to learn, son," William said while demonstrating how to use the mop, "is that there's no such thing as inferior work. There's work poorly done and work well done. The choice is always ours." Brandon, awkward in his new uniform and still processing the turnaround in his life, merely nodded. His hands, previously accustomed only to typing on computers and signing documents, now held cleaning tools with a mixture of apprehension and resignation. The lesson in humility was just beginning, and Taylor Family Supermarket would be the stage for a transformation that no one could have predicted. Brandon's first weeks as a janitor were an exercise in forced humility. Each morning, as he exchanged his Italian suit for the gray uniform, he felt the weight of his fall. The man who once strode through the corridors dispensing orders and intimidation now silently bent over dirty floors and stained bathrooms. William, his unlikely mentor, demonstrated infinite patience. "You see, young man," he explained while teaching the correct technique for cleaning windows, "every movement has its purpose. It's not just wiping randomly, it's ensuring people can see clearly through this glass, it's giving dignity to the environment." The blisters on his hands, unaccustomed to manual labor, were a constant reminder of his new reality. His back ached after hours of pushing the cleaning cart, and his knees protested after scrubbing particularly stubborn stains from the floor. One particularly busy morning, Brandon faced his biggest challenge yet, cleaning up a tomato sauce spill in the main hallway. As he worked, he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Brandon? Brandon Miller?" He turned to find Richard Parker, a former MBA classmate, looking at him with a mixture of shock and poorly concealed amusement. Brandon felt his face burning with shame. "My God, it really is you," exclaimed Richard, his immaculate suit painfully contrasting with Brandon's stained uniform. "What happened? Last I heard, you were implementing revolutionary management techniques here." Brandon opened his mouth to respond but was interrupted by William, who calmly approached. "Excuse me, sir," said the old janitor with dignity, "but we need to finish cleaning this hallway. Customer safety matter, you know?" Richard shot William a look of contempt before turning his attention back to Brandon. "Call me later, man. I need to know how you ended up like this." With a condescending smile, he walked away. Brandon stood there, paralyzed, the mop still in his hands. William placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You know, son," he said softly, "the true measure of a man isn't in the position he holds, but in how he treats others regardless of their status." Those words hit Brandon with unexpected force. How many times had he himself treated William and other employees with the same contempt that Richard had just displayed? The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. In the days that followed, Brandon began to notice things he'd never perceived in his previous position. He saw how Mrs. Martinez, an elderly customer, always left a thank you and a smile for the cleaning staff. He observed how Lisa, the young shelf stocker, saved a piece of cake for William every day. One afternoon, while cleaning the office that was once his, Brandon found an old photograph of the supermarket tucked behind a file. In it, Emily and John Taylor smiled alongside a much younger team, including Amanda Thompson and her parents. The genuine happiness in their faces made him question everything he believed about efficient management. "That photo is over 20 years old," said a voice behind him. It was Emily watching him from the doorway. "It was taken the day we first expanded the market." Brandon quickly tried to put the photo away, embarrassed at being caught snooping, but Emily gestured for him to wait. "You know, Brandon," she continued, entering the room, "that day we faced a terrible crisis. Our main refrigerator broke down and we lost an entire stock of perishables. But you know what happened?" Brandon shook his head, genuinely interested. "Every employee stayed after hours without asking for overtime pay to help resolve the situation. Amanda, still a child then, brought coffee for everyone. Her father, who was a mechanic, tried to fix the refrigerator until the early hours. He couldn't, but his effort meant a lot to us." Emily took the photo from Brandon's hands, looking at it fondly. "This is what it means to have a truly committed team. Not out of fear of punishment or financial incentives, but because they feel part of something bigger." In that moment, something broke inside Brandon. Tears he didn't know he was holding back began to stream down his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry for everything." Emily observed the man before her, no longer the arrogant manager, but someone who was finally beginning to understand the true meaning of leadership and community. "Brandon," she said gently, "sometimes we need to lose everything we thought was important to discover what really matters." That night, after his shift, Brandon didn't go straight home as usual. Instead, he drove to a small cafe on the other side of town. Amanda Thompson was there, working as a waitress, a job she'd found after her unjust dismissal. When she saw him enter, her expression immediately hardened. Brandon couldn't blame her. "Amanda," he began nervously, "I know I'm probably the last person you want to see, but I need to apologize to you." She crossed her arms, waiting. "What I did to you was unforgivable. Not just the unfair dismissal, but how I treated you and your history with the supermarket. I was so focused on numbers and efficiency that I forgot I was dealing with real people, with real lives." Amanda studied him for a long moment. "You're different," she finally said. "Something's changed?" Brandon looked at his calloused hands, so different from the soft executive hands he had just weeks ago. "Everything's changed. I've changed. And if you're willing, I'd like to talk to Mrs. Emily and Mr. John about rehiring you." Amanda's eyes widened in surprise. "You would do that?" "It's the least I can do," he replied. "Actually, if you'll let me, I'd like to do more. I have some ideas about how we can improve working conditions at the supermarket, this time really thinking about the people." Amanda's hesitant smile was the first sign that maybe, just maybe, redemption was possible. The next morning, Brandon arrived early to work. William was already there, preparing the cleaning equipment. "William," Brandon called out, "before we start, I need to tell you something." The old janitor stopped what he was doing, turning to face him attentively. "Thank you," said Brandon, his voice heavy with emotion. "Thank you for teaching me so much more than just how to clean a floor." William smiled, that wise smile that Brandon had learned to deeply respect. "You know, son, sometimes the path up begins when we accept going down a little." And so, pushing his cleaning cart through the aisles of Taylor's family supermarket, Brandon Miller began another workday, no longer as the arrogant manager who measured success in spreadsheets, but as someone who finally understood the true value of people and the real meaning of dignity in work. 6 months had passed since the day Brandon Miller traded his Italian suit for a janitor's uniform. Taylor's family supermarket had changed significantly during this period, but not in the way he had originally planned when he arrived as manager. On a sunny Saturday morning, the establishment was especially busy. A colorful banner hung at the entrance announcing, "Grand Reopening, 30 Years of History." The aroma of fresh bread from the bakery mingled with the smell of freshly brewed coffee, while old and new customers circulated through the impeccably clean aisles. Brandon, still wearing his gray uniform, but now with a different badge identifying him as Wellness and Operations Coordinator, watched the movement with a new kind of pride. It was no longer the arrogant pride of before, but something deeper and more genuine. "Everything is perfect, isn't it?" said William, approaching with his characteristic serene smile. The old janitor, now officially retired but present as a special guest, seemed satisfied with what he saw. "Thanks to you, William," Brandon replied, his voice carrying sincere gratitude. "You taught me so much more than just cleaning techniques." Brandon's transformation hadn't gone unnoticed by anyone. After completing his initial 3 months as a janitor, he surprised everyone by asking to continue in the position longer. "I still have a lot to learn," he had explained to Emily and John. During this period, Brandon began implementing changes, not through threatening memos or impossible goals, but through example and dialogue. He created an employee suggestion program, where each idea was truly heard and considered. He established a mentoring system, where experienced employees shared their knowledge with newcomers. Amanda Thompson had returned to the supermarket, not just as an employee but as customer service manager. Her personal experience with unfair treatment made her especially sensitive to the needs of both customers and employees. "I never thought I'd say this," Amanda commented, approaching Brandon with a clipboard in hand, "but you really changed this place for the better." Brandon smiled, remembering the day he went to the cafe to apologize to her. "Actually, I just helped bring back what should have always been. The spirit that Mrs. Emily and Mr. John created." The reopening event wasn't just a commercial celebration. It was a reaffirmation of the values that had made Taylor's Family Supermarket so special over 3 decades. Each employee wore a personalized badge with their photo and years of service, an idea Brandon had after understanding the value of each person's history there. Emily Taylor, elegant in her favorite blue dress, circulated among the guests with her usual grace. At her side, John, fully recovered from his heart problems, smiled seeing his establishment flourishing again. "You know, Brandon," said John, calling him to a quieter corner, "when my mother suggested that third option for you, I confess I was skeptical. But she was right as always." Brandon nodded, thoughtful. "Your mother saw something in me that I couldn't even see at the time. She gave me the chance not just to keep a job, but to become a better person." The celebration reached its peak when Emily stepped onto a small improvised stage to give a speech. The murmur of conversations immediately ceased, and all eyes turned to her. 30 years ago, she began, her voice clear and emotional, "When we first opened our doors, we had a dream. It wasn't just about selling products or generating profits. It was about creating a place where people could feel at home, where employees were family, where every customer was special." She paused, her eyes scanning the familiar faces in the crowd. "There were difficult times, it's true. Times when we almost lost that dream. But today, I look at all of you and see that our values haven't just survived, they've grown stronger." Emily then called Brandon to the stage, to many people's surprise. Brandon Miller came here as a manager focused only on numbers. Today he represents something far more valuable. Proof that people can change, can grow, can learn to see the world through different eyes. Brandon stepped onto the stage with humility, his calloused hands nervously adjusting the uniform he now wore with pride. The contrast with the arrogant executive from 6 months ago couldn't be greater. "When I arrived here," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "I thought I knew everything about business management. I had degrees, certificates, and MBA, but I had no idea about what really matters in a business, the people." He looked at William, who was smiling in the crowd. "I learned more about leadership pushing a cleaning cart than in all my years of study. I learned that respect isn't imposed, it's earned. That true authority doesn't come from fear, but from example." Brandon's words reverberated through the room, touching hearts in different ways. Longtime employees exchanged meaningful glances, remembering the difficult days under his former management. Regular customers nodded in approval, recognizing the positive changes in the establishment. The ceremony continued with tributes to the longest-serving employees, including a special one for William, who received a commemorative plaque for his years of dedication. The old janitor, with tears in his eyes, hugged each of his colleagues. At the end of the event, as the last guests were saying goodbye, Brandon found a moment to be alone in the supermarket's main aisle. There, where months before he had humiliated Amanda and mistreated Emily, he now saw a symbol of redemption and transformation. Emily found him there, contemplative. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. "About how you managed to see beyond my arrogance," he replied. "About how you turned my punishment into an opportunity for growth." Emily smiled, that wise smile that Brandon had learned to deeply respect. Sometimes we need to lose our position to find our purpose. Taylor's Family Supermarket continued its journey, now stronger than ever. Sales increased naturally, not through aggressive targets or excessive pressure, but because people genuinely preferred to shop there. The welcoming environment, attentive service, and mutual respect among everyone became its trademark. Brandon remained at the supermarket, but never returned to being the arrogant executive he once was. His new position as Wellness and Operations Coordinator allowed him to use his management experience in a more humane and constructive way. He still maintained some spreadsheets and reports, but now they serve to improve working conditions and customer service, not to intimidate or punish. The story of his transformation became a legend in the neighborhood, a reminder that humility and dignity are values that no MBA can teach, but that anyone can learn as long as they're willing to start from the ground literally. Dear friends, what did you think of this story of transformation and redemption? Do you believe that all people deserve a second chance when they show true remorse? How would you react if you were in Emily's position, giving someone who had hurt you an opportunity to change? Don't forget to leave your opinions in the comments. If you enjoyed this and want more intense stories like this one, leave your like and subscribe to Life Stories channel. This helps our channel grow and allows us to bring more exciting adventures to you. Until the next story.